It's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Wong. I've known him since about 1996 through an organization called the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society. He is a retired Lieutenant Colonel of Engineers, U.S. Army. He holds a PhD in Business Administration from Texas Tech University, and he does not have to stay in Holiday Inn Express to be an expert on military personnel issues. He is one of the leading analysts of manpower issues today. So without further ado, Lenny.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so contrary to everything we've had so far, I think I'm the only non-historian, non-political scientist that's speaking to you. And so I think you'll pick that up because most of the dates and other figures I use, I completely make them up as I go along. And so it's, but what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the evolution of the all-volunteer Army and how that's had an effect. And you see, I'm an organizational type person. I study organizations, and I want to look at the Army as an organization. And I'm supposed to tie it back to cultural and social changes, but you'll judge me on how well I do that. That's the title in the program. In 1970, the President's Commission on the All-Volunteer Force presented its report to then-President Richard Nixon. And this task force was supposed to determine the feasibility and the desirability of replacing conscription with an all-volunteer force. And they presented the report, and they stated in that report, "We unanimously believe that the nation's interests will be better served by an all-volunteer force supported by an effective standby draft." And then they added, "We have satisfied ourselves that a volunteer force will not jeopardize national security, and we believe it will have a beneficial effect on the military as well as the rest of society." That's the way the all-volunteer force began in 1970 when President Nixon said, "This is part of my campaign." And they said, "We are confident that it will not only support national security, but it will have a beneficial effect on the military and on society itself." Well, over 40 years have gone by since the beginning of the all-volunteer force, and it's time to look back and see how it did. General Max Thurman, who many people believe was the principal architect of the all-volunteer force, said, "You know, there's no sense in looking at the all-volunteer force as a monolithic, static entity, but you should really look at it in pieces." Now, he died in 1995, and he broke it into 5 pieces then. What I'm going to do is look at the all-volunteer Army in 5 eras, also break it into 5, to try to see what we could see was going on in the Army, what was going on in society, what was going on in the world, so we could take a look at how the all-volunteer Army has evolved. It was brought up in 1970 with the commission, produced their report. By 1973, all the debate had died down, and the statutory obligations for conscription expired, and the all-volunteer force started. So the first era I want to look at is from 1973 to 1980, the first era of the all-volunteer Army. Well, the all-volunteer Army got off to a good start, what looked like a good start, because Congress said, you know, we used to just force people into the military, and so we didn't really worry about how much we paid the first-term soldiers, because we forced them in. And so they said, we need to give them a pay raise, the first-term soldiers, to bring them up, because now we have to entice them in. So they gave them a pay raise. Now, what do you think would be a good pay raise? You know, I mean, really, how much a pay raise would you give them? They gave them a 61.2% pay raise for first-term soldiers. 61.2. You combine that with unemployment was starting to rise about that time. That looked like it put the all-volunteer force on pretty stable footing, except it had 2 unintended consequences. For decades after that, every time the Army went to Congress and said, we'd like another pay raise, what do you think Congress said? Didn't you guys get a 61.2% pay raise back then? And so that was one thing that happened. The other thing that happened, and this is indicative of the first era of the all-volunteer Army, is that that pay raise was targeted at first-term soldiers. And what it did was it raised the salary of first-term soldiers, privates, up to about sergeants. And so it demoralized the non-commissioned officer corps, because they looked at these new guys and said, what's the deal? And so that was the beginnings of the all-volunteer force. They tried to get it off on the right footing, but they had the wrong assumptions. The Gates Commission, that commission I was talking about was named the Gates Commission because it was led by former Defense Secretary Thomas Gates. The Gates Commission assumed that, they assumed that the force would be supported by a draft. They assumed that the force would be supported by a robust ROTC system. They assumed that African Americans would be in proportion to their population, 14 to 15%. 1973, African Americans made up 27% of the military. And so a lot of their assumptions were wrong. But they tried their best, but things didn't go as well as they wanted to. The money started drying up for recruiting, and so it was a hard time getting quality recruits in. Some things started happening right around that time. In 1973, the Chief of Staff of the Army, Creighton Abrams, came to the Army War College, where I work now, and he approached the faculty there and he said, I want you to work on a study. That study is called Why an Army? At that point, the Army was trying to figure out its reason for being. With the morale way down in the dumps after the Vietnam War, with the recruits not coming in the way they want them to be, with the funding having a hard time, there was a big problem in the Army about who are we, what are we trying to do, what's going on. In 1976, at the United States Military Academy at West Point, 150 cadets got caught cheating on an electrical engineering exam that was given out of class. The West Point officer pool was supposed to represent the professional foundation of the Army, and this shook it to its core. That was in the spring of 1976. In July of 1976, 119 women showed up at West Point for the first class with women, and 62 graduated 4 years later. But with that put in another into the mix of this all-volunteer Army, trying to figure out who it is, what are we trying to do, and who are we? It's a very hard time for the all-volunteer Army during that time. One way of measuring this, though, was to look, who are we bringing into the Army? So the Army was trying to say, who are we bringing in, and are they good enough? One way to measure who the Army's bringing in is examine how many Category 4 recruits they bring in. Now, the Category 4 is, you break the American society into different mental categories. The Army tries to recruit Category 1 to 3A. That's the top 50%. Category 5 is the bottom 10%. Category 4 is next to being mentally retarded. Okay? That's what it is. And what they said was, we could measure how high quality our soldiers are that we're bringing in by looking at how many Category 4 recruits we bring in. Well, what happened was in 1978, the Department of Defense put out a report and they said, we've been hearing a lot of bad stuff about the all-volunteer Army, but this is what we came up with. The quality of those serving on active duty, as measured by educational levels of active duty personnel, and the average test scores of new recruits has not declined as popularly believed, but has markedly and steadily improved since the end of the draft. Now, the way they measured the educational testing and the mental aptitude was with the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. You know what I'm talking about? ASVAB and the associated AFQT, Armed Forces Qualification Test. And that's the way you figure out people's mental categories. Well, back in 1973, they measured with the ASVAB and they said the number of Cat 4 recruits is dropping. That's good news, because we're not taking the bottom, we're taking Category 1 to 3A. And so here you can see that. Is everyone tracking so far? All right, so unbeknownst to the Department of Defense, is that the newly formed ASVAB test was misnormed. And in other words, it wasn't scored correctly. And instead of what they were telling Army recruiters to shoot for 5 to 6%, when they came back in 19 Cat 4s, when they came back with, well, we got 9%, everyone said, well, that's not that bad. But in reality, what happened was, in 1979, 42% Category 4s came into the Army. Now imagine that. Now the amazing thing about that, they were all in my platoon when I was a platoon leader. And so you cannot imagine what it was like working with people that were, no kidding, at the bottom 25% of the mental categories in the U.S. I remember one squad leader, I said, we were sitting out in the south post of Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and we're having one of these pretend war games, and I said, okay, here's the scenario. The Russians are attacking down through Canada. Our job is to, the Canadians have surrendered, and our job is to put up blocking positions for the infantry, and so we got to do this. And my one squad leader is shaking his head. I said, and I keep going, and he's shaking his head and not paying attention. I said, what's wrong with you? And he says, I just can't believe the Canadians surrendered. And I said, this is all pretend. He goes, oh, okay. And that's when I said, this is a Cat 4 Army. This is what you're working with. Okay, our equipment was broken. Drugs were rampant. We had racial problems. The first squad was white, the second squad was black, the third squad was white, the fourth squad was black, and they couldn't figure out who to make the platoon leader, so they put me in charge as sort of a moderator. But you couldn't do anything with the Army back then. That was the state of the Army, the all-volunteer Army. Well, how bad did it get? Well, this is how bad it got. It got so bad that with the taking of 66 hostages when they stormed the embassy in Tehran, we launched Operation Eagle Claw. And we left 8 dead Americans in the deserts of Iran. And it just compounded and symbolized the malaise that had crept into the military on how this all-volunteer force just couldn't do anything right. And it led then, in 1980, President Nixon, whose idea it was to bring to his campaign the all-volunteer force, said, you know what, maybe we should go back to the draft, because the volunteer army has failed to provide enough personnel of the caliber we need for our highly sophisticated armaments. So the first era of the all-volunteer army started off with what everyone thought was going to be great, but it really brought into effect the fact that, you know what, you need quality soldiers, you need quality equipment, you need quality training, we need to figure out what we're doing, and the Army just couldn't put it together. Now, we started seeing some change right around 1980 with the second all-volunteer Army era. First of all, what happened was that you started seeing some attention back on the pay. In 1981, they passed an 11.1% pay raise. 1983, they passed a 14.3% pay raise. I became a second lieutenant in the Army in 1980. I got married in 81. My wife and I thought that this was going to happen for the rest of our career, that you get a 25% pay raise every 3 years or something like that. But it was a myth, but I tell you what, try getting a 25% pay raise when you first jump into it. It really lifts everyone's morale. Also, what happened was that what we did was we shifted our approach on who we're going to bring in. You know, in the old days before the second era, back in the first era, when you looked at recruiting posters, they said something like this, because the Army's recruiting slogan was, today's Army wants to join you. When Max Thurman came in and he took over recruiting command, he became the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, he said, no more of this stuff. We're switching to be all you can be. And see, what Max Thurman understood is that if you want to bring in soldiers, there's 2 types of soldiers that are attracted to the Army. The first group are those attracted by higher pay and training. So they come in to learn a skill. The second group, however, is attracted to college. And we had gotten rid of the Vietnam GI Bill, and Max Thurman said we need another GI Bill, and so they brought back educational benefits. And so now we had a dual market approach to recruiting. Bring those in for higher pay and training, but also now appeal to those who are trying to get to college because they are motivated by deferred incentives. They are motivated by deferred incentives, but what they discovered was those who are college-bound, they were easier to train, they were better disciplined, and they retained better. And so they came in for college, but guess what? They didn't leave because they loved the Army, and they made much better soldiers. And so it was that dual market approach that started changing the way the Army was. We went from over 45% Cat 4s in the Army, down to 4%, down to 0% Cat 4s. We went to 100% high school graduates. Back in 1973, it was only 58% high school graduates. Suddenly, coming into the Army was something you could actually change to make quality people coming in. And so the change was very impressive because things just turned around, and you could feel this whole thing in the Army. You could feel something changing. In 1983, the Army said, you know what, now that we're recruiting soldiers instead of just drafting or conscripting them, we've got to think about other motivations. And so they did a white paper on the Army family. The Army family, that was something new for the Army. And they renewed the commitment to wellness, they renewed the commitment to community to the Army family. And during 1983, they raised the budget for family housing by 57% by infusing $74 million into the houses because they understood that, look, if we're going to keep this soldier here, we've got to also work on that family. And so that's the family and the soldier now that helped keep this quality soldier in. It was also during this time, and we heard someone allude to this in an earlier presentation, is that there was a culture change going on in the Army, because during the draft, if a soldier was not performing, you just said, get rid of him, because there's always another one right behind them. During the all-volunteer Army, the Army had to overcome a culture where you viewed soldiers as valued, but they were a free good. In other words, if you got rid of a soldier, there's not another one coming right behind them, because someone has to go recruit this soldier. And so people learned that if you don't treat the soldiers well, if you don't train them well, if you don't give them something challenging, they will leave. And that's a problem in an all-volunteer Army. And so this culture change started coming over as you can't treat the soldiers as a free good. There was also some other improvements during this second era of the all-volunteer Army, and that, someone discussed this earlier, is that's the introduction of the Big Five. And actually, I think there's more like the Big Eight, but the Big Five, the Apache, the Black Hawk, the Abrams, the Bradley, and the Patriot were the Big Five weapons programs that they had talked about in the 70s, but they came in the 80s. They were all brand new. They're all brand new. Now, the irony is we still have all of those today. They're not brand new anymore. But imagine at that time, you went from all the old stuff to all this stuff. We had been touting the Army as a high-tech force, and now we had high-quality soldiers, and finally we could give them high-tech equipment. Combined with that high-tech equipment, it brought in what they called the training revolution. That training revolution said, you know what? We know the Soviets are our enemy. We need to train for it. And so they brought in deliberate planning. They brought in measurable outcomes. We're not just going to train and say we train. We're going to have measurable outcomes. And they brought in continual evaluation. And this all culminated in the epitome of the National Training Center out at Fort Irwin, California, where they had deliberate planning, they had measurable outcomes, and they had continual evaluation. Everything there was instrumented. Imagine a place the size of Rhode Island, where every vehicle has laser receptors, every person has laser receptors, and you have observer controllers, and you have mountains with instrumented sensors telling where everyone is and what's going on, and they could track every single battle, what's going on. And so there, they could go through the script of what the Soviets could do, and they go through the script of the way you would go against the Soviets, and they worked at it over and over and over again until they understood exactly what the Soviets were going to do, and they had a really well-trained army. They say that at Fort Irwin, it was the best Soviet-trained unit in the world because they were better than the Soviets, because they had practiced so many times. But that was the training revolution. It started turning things around. During this time period also, you saw the non-commissioned officer corps get revitalized. They used to say you just became a sergeant by getting older. Now what they said is, no, we're going to send you to school, you're going to learn the profession. And so NCOs in the Army started becoming the real backbone of the Army. And while officers did other things, the NCOs started taking charge because they felt that things were changing in the Army. What happened to all this? Well, it all led to the payoff of the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989, but also the 100-hour war for Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. That was the validation that, you know what, all this effort that we put in to the all-volunteer Army, it paid off. It was worth it. Such a contrast to the first era of the all-volunteer Army. Any questions on the second era? We're going to ask questions now, so then I could go longer later. Go ahead.
You said in 1980, President Nixon said perhaps we should go back to the draft.
Correct.
Is that former President Nixon?
Yes,
or?
former.
Okay,
right.
Thank you.
Right. He was writing a book in 1980. So, second era, it was a renaissance for the profession. It was a renaissance for understanding what a military should do. It was a renaissance that material and everything else just went along with lifting everything up. The third era, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm over, the nation's attention shifted, and budgetary constraints got put in, and so it was time to reap the peace dividend. And so the military and the Army said, okay, what's the outcome for us? For the Army, the budget shrank. Specifically, what happened? It went from an Army of about 781,000 people down to 480,000 people, a cut of a third. of the Army being downsized from 1990 to 1997, 1991 to 1997, cut a third. Well, what does that look like? Well, for the officer corps, they offered a bunch of incentives. They booted people out. They early retired people. Or they had, instead of a promotion board, they had separation boards where they looked at and the list came out and it was people who were no longer invited to be in the Army. And what you saw was 24,000 officers either enticed, induced, or encouraged to leave. Well, how many is 24,000 officers? Well, that's more than all the officers in the Marine Corps. That's what happened during this time period of the third era of the all-volunteer Army. So you imagine what that did to the Army. And so what happened was that the planners of the downsizing had gone through the downsizing after Vietnam. The downsizing after Vietnam was conducted by, if you didn't go to Vietnam, you didn't stay in the Army. And if you went to Vietnam and you didn't get a Silver Star, then we'll think about kicking you out. They had seen that. They'd seen the damage of giving pink slips after Vietnam, and they said, we're going to conduct this downsizing better. And so they did try to conduct the downsizing better by offering transition assistance, by offering incentives, by making sure everyone knew the plan. But the downsizing had three specific effects on the officer corps especially. The first thing that it did was it broke the informal contract between the officer corps and the Army. When officers came into the Army, they said, there's an informal contract that we have that I will trust that you will provide me this opportunity, and if I put in more than average effort into a job, because I see it as my calling, there's an informal contract here. Officer Corps saw it as breaking the informal contract. Well, what did that do? Well, when you break an informal contract and you say there's no longer job security here, it introduces competition. And so during this era, you saw the rise of hyper-competition. You saw zero defects mentality. You saw careerism all kick into the officer corps because suddenly nobody was assured of their job security. And so it made people very anxious. So they started competing with each other. So first effect was breaking of the informal contract. Second effect was that people were very concerned about what is the future. Uncertainty crept in to the entire military because with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the evil empire was gone, and now the Army was unsure of what its mission was. FM1, which talks about the Army's role, said that the mission is not just to fight America's wars, but it's to serve the American people. Well, what does serve the American people mean as an Army? And so Officer Corps was not only, did they feel that their contract with the government was broken, but they also felt, we're not even sure where we're going. What is the role of the military in national security? The third thing it did was the officers expected the compassion and kindness of the Army to be shown to those who leave. Because what they discovered is that the worse you treat the people who are leaving, the worse people who stayed felt. And so the Army bent over backwards to give a lot of incentives, a lot of transition assistance to people, and that was a lot better than the Vietnam downsizing. So that's what had an effect on the officer corps of the downsizing. But without a mission to fight wars, and just a mission to serve the American people, America's Army reverted then to missions that it used to have. In the past, America used to send soldiers out west. Well, during the third era of the all-volunteer Army, they shifted again to sending soldiers out west, only this time not to defend the frontier, but this time to fight forest fires. They used to send soldiers down to the borders to fight the wars, small wars down there. During this era, the Army sent people down to the borders not to do that, but instead to help with the war on drugs. They used to send soldiers to faraway places for constabulary duty. During this era, they did sent them off to faraway places for peacekeeping and humanitarian reasons. So they sent them to Haiti, to Somalia, to Rwanda, to Bosnia, to Kosovo. All during this time, the Army is saying, well, do we do peacekeeping or don't we do peacekeeping? And so there was sort of an anxiety and angst that was coming across the whole Army. Should we be doing this? Well, that uncertainty was all leading up, and in October of 2000, General Shinseki, Chief of Staff of the Army, made a speech in front of the Association of the United States Army in Washington, D.C., and during that time, he brought up what he said was three major changes to the Army. He was going to address this unit status reporting system. He was going to talk about the beleaguered military medical system, and he was going to try to cut down on deployment time for these soldiers that were going to Haiti, to Rwanda, to Somalia, to Bosnia, Kosovo, because he thought that deployment was taking up too much of their lives and it was wearing them out. But then he made another suggestion, and everyone forgot about all those other issues, and he made a suggestion that it seems to be the only suggestion that people remember about that speech, and that was he wanted to outfit everyone in the Army with a beret. Well, the day he announced that, there was an outcry. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, the Rangers, the Special Forces, they all had an uproar about their loss of distinctiveness. You had a group of former Rangers march from Fort Benning, Georgia, to the White House carrying a beret in protest. When Congress found out that the berets were made in all places, China, they got involved. And meanwhile, the public stood back and said, what in the world is going on? What's this big hullabaloo over a hat? Well, it wasn't over a hat. General Shinseki had looked out and said, we had trained so much for the Cold War, we had trained so much for the Soviet hordes, our National Training Center is still conducting these rehearsals for the next war that I don't think is coming. And he had tried to shift the Army into preparing for this uncertain future that he was seeing. And he said, it's time to shed all this Cold War assumptions. It's time to shed our heavy desire to carry around tanks everywhere we go. And he said, if you look back, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait and we tried to put up the defenses in Saudi Arabia, the best we could do was send 82nd Airborne. And he said, when we tried to go into Kosovo, when we tried to take Task Force Hawk in there, it was a disaster because we're carrying around so much junk from the Cold War, we need to change. And so he brought the beret in as a symbol of unity towards this change. And what that symbol of unity really showed was the foot dragging, the talking behind his back, and the complaining about the change to the future because nobody wanted to do it. The Army Research Institute did a survey during that time period, and 50% of the battalion and brigade commanders said they were uncomfortable with the changes that General Shinseki was introducing. That's a reflection of this third era of the all-volunteer force. The Army was struggling to hold on to that Cold War, that force that won Desert Shield, Desert Storm. But all that uncertainty came to a halt during the fourth era. September 11th, all that talk went away because suddenly the Army was right back, and now it was confronted with reality, no longer talk. With the September 11th attacks, and we heard this from Steve Biddle, the first thing the Army had to do was they got sent to Afghanistan. But right there was a discussion that Steve talked about, is that could we now use the Army, instead of those heavy divisions, could we now accomplish everything with just a Special Forces team? And so when we first went into Afghanistan, that's what it turned into. And that there was a lot of discussion in the Army, maybe we don't need the Army anymore because we'd accomplished everything with the Special Forces team. But in March of 2003, when we invaded Iraq, suddenly the Army was put back on display, and all the training that went on in the National Training Center for the first 3 weeks of the Iraq War, it went exactly as planned. It went exactly as planned. You see what happened before this era? You remember all that training I told you that took place in the National Training Center? How we taught the Soviet doctrine, and everyone knew exactly what the Soviets were going to do, and so we knew exactly what we had to do in response? We had taken that approach, and we had put that into peacekeeping even. And so when you went on a peacekeeping mission, you went through what they called a mission rehearsal exercise where everything you needed to know about peacekeeping, we had a menu for, and we had an exact way to do it. And so you knew exactly what you had to do because you were very, very trained on it and very competent in it. Well, all that training paid off when we went into Iraq because everyone knew exactly what to do for 3 weeks. After the 3 weeks, suddenly all rules were gone. And suddenly everyone was looking at the military saying, well, you set up the country. And suddenly we were looking at our officers and saying, you know what, that old training regimen we had, it produced very, very competent junior officers. But they were not as capable as we wanted them to be because we never taught them to think on their own. And so we had a training regimen during the third era that that really taught compliance instead of creativity. It really taught reactive thought instead of proactive thought. And it really taught adherence instead of audacity. It was during this era, not because of anything the Army did, but because of the serendipity of being put in a war where doctrine no longer was there to tell us what to do, that we started developing a different type of junior officer. And that's a junior officer who was adaptable, who was mentally agile, who couldn't be told what to do in the post-war Iraq because there was no one who knew what to do, and there was no one to tell them what to do. And so this was the start of a different type of leader in the armies because there was no doctrine. Everyone was so dispersed that they just had to be leaders out there on their own. This went on to Afghanistan, where at first we approached it in a similar way, but then we started discovering that, we've got to let the leaders lead. Got to let the leaders lead. And so what you see now in the Army is an entire generation of junior officers who are used to leading. They're not used to being told what to do because there is no set pattern. They're not used to the giant bureaucracy of the Army managing every piece of their life because in combat they had a lot of responsibility and they were given a lot of latitude to make their own decisions. That's what came out of this. But the biggest thing that came out of the Iraq and Afghanistan experience for the all-volunteer force was not just an extremely competent force, but understanding the limitations of the all-volunteer force. In 2003, when they looked at the American public and they asked, was the invasion of Iraq a mistake or not, 23% of Americans said that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. In 2008, that had climbed to 63%. 2001, when you asked Americans, was going into Afghanistan a mistake, less than 10% said it was a mistake. In 2014, 49% said it was a mistake, 48% said it wasn't a mistake. So we saw a huge shift in societal support for the wars. And so what we started seeing is the all-volunteer force being pulled. Because remember the Gates Commission, it was based on some assumptions. One, it was based on an assumption of an 800,000-man army. And it was also based on the assumption of a supporting draft. But we were never going to draft anybody. And so what happened was that you had soldiers deploying to this conflict where everyone understood that a one-year deployment would be very hard. But no one ever thought that multiple deployments would kick in, where soldiers would go 4, 5, 6 times with only a year break in between. And so the Gates Commission that set up the all-volunteer army was never envisioned wars that would last decades instead of years. And so it was during this era of the all-volunteer force that people started questioning, I'm not sure if the all-volunteer force can sustain this. In the darkest days of Iraq in 2007, the Army had such a hard time bringing in quality soldiers that they started adjusting. And so they started giving out waivers for age, waivers for medical problems, waivers for moral issues, that's if they committed crimes, and also waivers for mental capability. And so there was an influx of soldiers that came into the Army that were not high quality because we were so desperate to bring them in. Now that has turned around since, but people could really feel that the all-volunteer force was being stretched. It was during that time also that the reserve component, who used to think that their participation was a weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer, they discovered that they're being stretched. And they started seeing that the reserve component, if you really looked at a lot of people who worked in the reserve component, they were either teachers, policemen, or state or students, or state or federal employees. They weren't really representing the country like we thought the reserve component was doing because we were wearing them out so much, because who can take a year off, come back for a year, and then go back another year, except for those populations. And so the all-volunteer force started getting stretched more and more, and people started saying, when is it going to end? So this fourth era of the all-volunteer army, we saw an all-volunteer force that was tired. Its equipment was worn out. It was extremely competent. But it had a hard time sustaining itself because it was just worn out. The fifth era of the all-volunteer army is the one we're entering now. And the nation is sending a not-so-subtle signal with a pivot towards Asia that, you know what, our interest in long wars, our interest in deployed soldiers in foreign countries has gone down. And so the Army has felt that. You combine that with the Congress's inaction to deal with sequestration, and we see that the Army's like, okay, you know, we used to be the wild card. If you let sequestration go through, the military's not going to get budgeted. It's not going to get funded. Congress said, okay, fine. So when that came through, suddenly there's a giant realization that, you know what the future is? The future is not going to be that great for the military, the Army in particular. So a downsizing is upon us again. Now we're talking about dropping down to 450,000 or 420,000. There's even been some talk of 380,000 soldiers in the Army. So this is a new time of uncertainty that the Army's walking into. And yet, during this time of uncertainty, we have that against the backdrop of things happening in Ukraine, things happening in Syria, and things happening in Africa and other places, that the Army is now finds itself looking out upon all this stuff, saying, okay, are we going to get involved in this stuff someday? Or are we going on with this downsizing, with this pivot towards Asia? Or what's going on? Now, as far as cultural and social issues, back in the fourth era, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed with little fanfare. The combat exclusion rule for women was determined moot because of the war. And then instead, the Secretary of Defense said, instead of us saying where women can be, let's say they're going to be everywhere, you come back, services, and tell me where they can't be, and you better have some data to back it up. And so the services are going to come back shortly with that. That's going on. As far as minority representation, you know that 27% African-American representation back in 74, that's come all the way back down to about 14 to 15%. It dropped during the wars because not so many people wanted to come in during the wars who were looking for job training or opportunities. You really had to want to come into the military during the wars if you knew you were going to get deployed shortly. And so all those numbers started coming back down, and that's where we are now. But if we go back to the original slide that I showed you, you could see the confidence that the Gates Commission had in this all-volunteer force. You could see that the all-volunteer force was something that they said would benefit not just the military, but it would benefit the society. So the question is what is society's perception of the military? Well, Gallup does a poll, and what they do is they ask us, tell me how confident you are, and then they look at many institutions. When you look at the military institution, what you could see is back down here in 1973, this is America's confidence in the military. And you could see back here it was a little below 60%. Right now we're about 78%. The military is the highest ranked institution in the United States as far as confidence by the public. Why is that? And if you look here, you could almost see the different eras. You could see the first era is 73 to 80, and then you could see 80 to 91 around there, 91 to 2000, and 2000 till now, and then beyond. You could see how things now. What's interesting to look at this is, where's Aberdeen? Where's Abu Ghraib? They don't make a difference. You know, every ethical scandal we have, it doesn't budge. For some reason, it doesn't budge all these. Where's Tailhook? It doesn't budge all those things. Is what happens is the society looks at the military and it says to itself, are you doing your job and are you looking out for society's interest? As long as you're doing those two things, you police your own, find every scandal you have, it's nice reading, but that's not going to affect our confidence in you. Because when you compare the military to other institutions and try to figure out what makes an institution confident in the public's eyes, you look at the ones that are high and have stayed high, you see police and small business up there. Are you doing your job and are you looking out for society's interests? If you want to hold society's esteem, you have to do your job and look out for society's interests. If If you look at some other institutions that don't do that, the interesting one to contrast, I put these other ones in there just because they're fun to look at, but look at big business versus small business. Are you doing your job? I think both of them are, but are you looking out for society's interest? That's where big business gets a low rating, but small business stays up there. Now, here's the trivia question. Where do you think public schools are? That has nothing to do with my talk, but I thought I'd throw it in there. Okay. So how is this profession, how is this institution called the All-Volunteer Army doing as far as what it intended to do? Well, we saw it go through the growing stages. We saw it being used magnificently, but now we're in another stage. What could affect the standing of the military in the public's eyes? You go back to the Gates Commission, you could start seeing some clues. One thing is are you looking out for America's best interests? Is the military looking out for America's best interests? Well, one way, as we approach this fifth era of figuring that out, could be fighting over the federal budget. If you look at the federal budget, we see that you got your major entitlements there. There's the national defense piece. Income, security, veterans benefits, that's the interest we got to pay on debt, and then you got a bunch of small things. As we shrink the federal budget, what's the likelihood of us changing any of these? Not much. Not much. We're not going to fiddle with those things. So the most likely place to take it is defense. If the public starts seeing the military scrapping for its slice of the pie, that's when we'll see confidence in the military drop, because now they're not looking out for America's best interests. So a lot of times people expect people in the military to fight for every dollar they can get out of the federal pie. You know what? You could do that, but it's going to affect societal support, societal confidence in the military. This is where the military finds itself right now as it approaches this next era. Are you doing your job, and are you looking out for the best interests of society? Here's another factor that could affect the American military's standing with society, and that is the way we treat veterans. The way we treat veterans. Because now that we have a giant influx of veterans, society's watching to see how they're treated. Now, whose responsibility is it to take care of veterans? Governmentally. The Department of Veterans Affairs. Is that part of the military? No. Does America know that? No, they don't care. And so if we start seeing veterans having problems, they're going to turn around and say to the military, why didn't you take care of it? And the military can't say, well, that's a different cabinet official. Actually, it's General Shinseki now. But no one wants to hear that. And so if we start seeing people having problems with veterans, people will say, that's the military. They're not taking care of their own. And so that will bring it down. But then there's another factor, and we saw this back in the original Gates Commission. When the original Gates Commission emerged, there was some critics of the all-volunteer force who said, you know what, you got to be careful of this all-volunteer force because you're going to lose control of them. You're going to lose civilian control of an all-volunteer force. You make a professional army, you got to be careful because you're starting to create this club that the civilian politicians won't be able to rule. Well, the Gates Commission said, we're not worried about that. I understand what you're talking about, but we're not that worried about that. And the Gates Commission said, in their report, they said, you know, those people that were criticizing, they were so worried about civilian control, the Gates Commission said, this is what they also said about those critics. They also fear that the military will acquire excessive political and social influence. That these fears appear groundless, though. An all-volunteer force will not have any more influence on the president, Congress, or the rest of society than the military now possesses. This is what the Gates Commission said. They assumed that the military will never gain political control. Well, as we enter this fifth era of the all-volunteer force, we're starting to see a trend. And that trend is a lot of retired general officers getting involved politically. And when you see a host of general officers sponsor, well, actually they do this. They stand on the stage of both parties. Have you seen that? You know, get all the general officers up here and they all stand up there. Does society know that they are all retired and they're no longer generals? No, they identify themselves as general, so-and-so, and so everyone just, in their mind, they connects that with the military. The military doesn't have any control over retirees, thank goodness. But guess what? As far as society, they see that as an extension of the military. And so the third factor that I believe that could affect the military standing with society of this all-volunteer force is excessive political involvement of the retired population, specifically general officers, because society can't tell the difference between a general officer who's on active duty and who's not on active duty. And all it takes is them to get up there and people start saying, you know, that military that used to be apolitical, it's starting to get political and they're not looking out for my best interest. If you look at those other institutions that all took nosedives, it's because they were viewed as becoming too political. So, what I talked about then is I talked about 5 eras of the all-volunteer force. The all-volunteer force at the first era started off really bad. But we learned what quality soldiers should be. We learned that you got to work hard at an all-volunteer force, and you have to treat it well. The second era, they learned that, through good training and a lot of investment, we could turn this force around. The third era, the country wanted its peace dividend. They took it back. It was a time of uncertainty. It was a time of angst. It was time of hand-wringing. It was time of looking for identity. The fourth, get back to work. Get back to work, but we started wearing out the all-volunteer force. And now we're in the fifth, a time of uncertainty again, a time of the country saying, you know what, we're not going to go with the large military. In 1983, at a conference discussing the all-volunteer force, Caspar Weinberger got up and gave a talk, and he said, to the American people, we know that the experiment is over. He said, we know that the all-volunteer force has succeeded, and we know how to make it succeed. Well, if you look at all the eras of the all-volunteer force, and you understand he said that in 1983, but look at what happened. Considering the hardships and the lessons learned in the past, and considering the uncertainty in the future, maybe we don't know if the all-volunteer force has been a success. And maybe we don't know everything it takes to make it succeed. And maybe this experiment we call the all-volunteer force still goes on. What are your questions?
We'll start with Gary Morris.
Gary, we had an agreement, Gary. You did not ask a question. Okay.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this. I got a couple questions, and one I had already asked previously of a different presenter. Do you think that the fact that we went to an all-volunteer force causes a disconnect sometimes with the general public, where when they're off fighting somewhere, the general public just stops being concerned about where they're at, what's going on? And because of that disconnect, they become less caring about the military and what they're going through. And I guess the other question I have is there a idea of what size force we should have in the United States Army to handle the different threats that are out in the world? And I realize that second question is probably very theoretical and very difficult, but yeah. I'm curious your thoughts.
I'll handle the first one, and I'll sort of ignore the second one. So the first one is there a gap between society and the military with the all-volunteer force? Well, you got to remember, when we had the draft, we had a draft board, but it really wasn't a draft board. It was really a deferment board, because the majority of people got deferments. I mean, they spent all their time trying to figure out who was not going to serve during the draft days, because we didn't have enough jobs to put people into. If we had a draft, that's what we would do. I think we all yearn for some type of national service. I think we all yearn for some type of increased citizenship. I don't think we're all saying put them in the Army, because we wouldn't have anything for them to do. And we don't want all of them. I think the most ardent opponents of the draft are people in uniform. because they want to be selective. You know, we pass around this self-congratulatory stat that we made up saying only 1/3 of Americans can make it into the military because of all the restrictions. And so but is there a gap? I think if you look at the past era, there wasn't a gap because of the heavy use of the reserve component. It's really hard to say I don't want to have anything to do with the military when people down the street are undergoing deployments. And so I think that's a key thing that keeps America. But like you said, if you wear out the all-volunteer force, all you do is get your teachers, your state policemen, your federal employees, and your state employees that go in the reserve component. You got to be careful that you got to want the reserve component really be citizen soldiers. So no, I'm not that concerned that there's a gap. The military's in the news enough, and people know enough people.
We have a question from Janine Davidson.
Wait a minute, a presenter asking a question? Isn't there like a rule against that?
Right. Thanks for this awesome presentation. You didn't touch on the sort of dramatic rise in compensation in your fourth era. 57%,
Correct.
I believe, is the increased cost per soldier or personnel across the military. And all this, there's a lot of debate over compensation. Well, there's a little bit of debate over compensation, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Where society is hurting on things like healthcare,
Right.
jobs,
Right.
and education,
Right.
and we have piled on benefits in healthcare, veterans' preference for jobs, education,
Right.
and the average soldier makes a lot more than his counterparts in civilian. Do you worry about that?
They say that a captain in the Army today is making as the most they'll ever make in their lifetimes. When they get out of the Army, they will never make as much as a captain makes today. And you're right. What we've given soldiers today is essentially a blank check, because that was the one way that society showed that they supported their troops, is saying give them everything they want. And guess what? Those in the military, we took it as fast as we could get it. I mean, you're not going to turn it down. And so it was a spiral. And so appetites got very strong. The checkbook was always open. And so now one thing I regret is I retired in 2000. That was bad timing, because guess what? In 2001, you saw everything jump up. Everything just jumped up. And so my retirement is much smaller than, so I do hold it against them. No. But guess what? People in the military know it. They know it. And it's hard for a retired officer to talk about it, because then they always hold up an enlisted person who doesn't get as much in retirement and say, well, yeah, it's easy for you to say, but it's not so easy. But if you look at our retirement system, if we grandfather those who are in the military right now and say, we're not going to break this contract we made with you when you came in. We're not going to break that with you. We're going to keep that going. But for everyone else who comes in, we're going to change it. And we're going to say, well, maybe right now you have to wait till 20 years to get any retirement. So what if we changed it so that, okay, you start putting into a thrift savings plan, and at 10 years, you could take out of the thrift savings plan. So you get some retirement if you leave at 10. And, instead of just getting your 50% of your pay in retirement like I get, as soon as I hit 20 years, 41 years old, I started getting a pension. Isn't that ridiculous? Don't tell me. All right, so instead of getting it after 20 years, maybe when you're 55, that'll kick in. Okay, and so we could do a lot of those things, and yes, would the incoming people buy it? I think they would. I think they would. So I am one who says, I think military compensation has gotten out of control. I'm not sure I should bring this kind of stuff up, Paul, but how much do we as retirees pay in health care per year? What do you think? Yeah, $485 a year. A year. Could we double that? Could we double that, and would that be fair? Yeah, I think we could. Okay, and so has military compensation gone rampant? It has. It has. But the question is where do you draw the line? And this is where I come from, is that the military is not a business. It's a profession, and it's a different type of profession. It's a profession where you expect the person to lay down everything that they don't come in and expect to work 8 to 5. They don't come in expecting weekends to be off. They don't come in expecting life to be pleasant. They come in and say, I will throw it all down. And so when someone does that, though, we have to do something differently than just another corporation. And so I think if we could be generous, we should be extremely generous. But can we throttle it back? Yeah, we can throttle it back. Like I said, the last thing we want to see is a military scrapping for pieces of that federal pie, because the society's going to look at that and say, you're getting political. You're going to start to unionize next, and you're going to start fighting for your rights, and we don't like a military that does that. That was a long... What? Who is it, though? That's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm saying. You got people that are helping us. You got these organizations that start protesting anytime you touch anything. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? We don't need that help. We don't need that help.
Jay LeBlanc.
Again, thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to ask specifically, you mentioned briefly in Era 4 about the role of the reserve component, and add to that the National Guard. And I wanted to ask two things. Number one, about the varied roles. It seems like in many ways now the Reserve and the National Guard is taking on all the things of Era 3 and more, everything from fighting fires to peacekeeping to, just whatever's necessary. And along with that, and more in the personnel area, it seems like now we depend on the Reserve and National Guard for all of those little niche MOSs that, well, you don't want to keep those on active duty, but when we need that water purification specialist, we can drag them out after 15 or 20 years of in private life and say, hey, you ought to remember how to do this from back in the 90s. Is that realistic as we go forward?
Right. To address that second part, I think that a lot of times we have shifted a lot of stuff over just as a holding place and saying, we need that capability. But I think we're starting to see now a reevaluation of the role of the reserve component. It used to be a strategic reserve, and then we shifted it to an operational reserve during the wars. And now we're reevaluating that. I think one place you could see that is that the active Army turned to the Army National Guard and said, why do you have all the Apache helicopters? You guys would be better off if we swapped out our Black Hawks so you could do flood relief and things like that, and give us the Apaches so we could maintain that role, because that's a war-fighting role. Well, how did that go over with the National Guard? Not well. Not well at all. Why? Because the National Guard says, well, first of all, there's 52 influences of the National Guard on Congress, because each state has their own. They don't report through the Army. And so they immediately went in and say, no, we're not going to give up our Apaches, because that gives up we're not going to feel like part of the Army. We give that up. And so I think right now you're seeing a tussle over the role of especially the National Guard, but also the Army Reserve. What is the role of the Army Reserve? Because they got used bad during the last wars, and how can they sustain anyone joining the Army Reserve if the next war we have that you go a year, come back, go a year? What kind of job can you hold that can do that? So there is a tussle right now. And even though I think you'll see all the general officers at those levels smiling and shaking hands, go behind the scenes, and there's a lot of tussling going on. So I don't think there's an easy answer, because we don't know what the future is. It'd be easy if we knew what the future was going to be, but we don't. And so now everyone's positioning themselves, saying, okay, what's going to happen? The other thing is that the whole pie for the Army is being shrunk. And so you got inside the Army, the different divisions are fighting over those pieces of the pie too. And nobody wants to trade off everything. So, roundabout answer saying it's still up in the air.
Curtis White, please.
All right, mine's a little off-the-wall question, and it kind of deals with the last level. And it's current. The information I'm reading and discussing with other people is that our Congress has done away with posse comitatus law, and our current administration is now weeding out certain general officers who will not say that they will fire upon private citizens of the United States. And also the fact that so much of the military surplus is being given to police forces around our country? Why does a city of 2,000 people need armored personnel carriers, things of that nature? In other words, what I want to know from you is, or anyone else in this room,
Yeah, I was going to say, why are you asking me, Curtis?
from anyone else in this room, are general officers being retired if they can't answer that question correctly, according to the current administration?
Okay, let's see. You know how a good question answer period, I'll take your question and turn it into something totally different and answer a different question. So I'll do that. Oh, pause. Okay, he had a question saying, are general officers being fired? Are general officers being fired because they disagree with the administration on things like, would you fire on a person? But what about equipment that states want to, like an MRAP? They want to bring an MRAP down to a sheriff or a police department, and people get upset that you're looking too militarized. Could you comment on that? And the answer is no. No, I'm just kidding. I can't comment on that. No, our general officers being fired. General officers are always being fired. Okay, that's one thing that people don't know. General officers are always being fired. When they sign on to be a general, they have to literally say, I serve at the pleasure of the chief of staff. So the chief of staff says, I don't think you're on board. You're out. Okay, and what we don't give, we like to think that the senior officers are all doofuses somehow, but they're not. They have a long-term vision, and they're watching out for the institution. And so if a general officer says something, does something, intimates something that's going to hurt the institution, they will have a heart-to-heart talk and say, I love you like a brother. You know we've been through war together, but you're not helping us. So could you quietly leave? And so I think that's what happens. So I have maybe a naive trust, but I still have a trust that our senior officers get it. They understand that we have a profession that's nestled in society. It's not just my rights come before everyone else. So I think that plays well for discussions, but in reality, there's some very responsible people that are holding the profession, and they know it. And so I trust them. As far as MRAPs, yeah, I could see communities saying, why do we have an MRAP in our town? Because they're free. I mean, really, we have 21,000 MRAPs to get rid of. I'd take one. I bet you we'll see one out here someday. There you go. I mean, they're trying to give them away. So I don't see anything wrong with that. If they could invent a hybrid model, that would be really cool. So.
Bruce Damasio.
Thank you for a first-class presentation as well. When you talk about all volunteer armies, you mentioned earlier the ASVAB test. And that leads to my question about the role of not only that test and its evolution over these eras, but the role of the recruiter in the high schools and recruiting itself. Because as each era changed, clearly recruiting's changed. And the people in this room who teach in public schools have seen that change in styles of recruiters over different eras. So would you comment a little bit about the recruiter themselves, where they fit in this process, and where do you think they're going in this next era?
Okay, the role of the recruiters. What's interesting about the Army is, who are these recruiters?
Usually that's
Are they professional recruiters? A third of them are, okay, but 2/3 of them are people they just take off the line and they bring in. There's not too many organizations that do that say we're going to turn our recruiting over to some schmuck, right? I mean, really, and we're going to put them out there. Well, that's what the Army does, is that they have some professional recruiters. Those are the guys without combat patches. If you want to go in any recruiting office, look on their right sleeve. If they don't have any patch there, they've been sitting in a recruiting office the entire time. The other ones, they've been there, they've done that, and they love the Army so much that they trust them to go out and recruit. That's amazing, okay? As far as a recruiter in the school, this is my advice to you. Not that you asked for advice, you asked a question, but this is my advice to you. Use the Army. Use the Army. Does the Army have good educational benefits? Holy smokes, do they have good education. I wish they had them when I was in. Now you get not only money for school, but what can you do with that money? You could give it to your spouse or your kids now. I couldn't do that. So I said maybe I should take cooking classes or something like that. But that's a good deal. You know, is the pay good? The pay's really good. So should we be ashamed of having someone in your school who has a giant opportunity, as long as you understand what you're getting into? As long as you understand what you're getting into, it's a good deal. Okay, does it promote citizenship? Go for it. Does it give you permission to tell stories that never happened for the rest of your life? Yes. Okay? So use the recruiter. Don't view him as a threat. Don't welcome him with both open arms, okay? But use him. That's my approach with that. As far as what's the recruiting outlook going to look like, again, we don't even know what the Army's going to look like. The Army's still recruiting. We always need people. It's a constant flux, but nobody really knows. Everyone's sort of waiting to see what happens.
Randall Lanning.
Again, sir, an absolutely awesome presentation. I came in active duty myself in 1973, and I was right at that cusp point. And my family, my uncles, my dad, the people you deal with, they'd all served, or most of them had served in the military. And what I had found is that the military, through the conscription or draft process, basically taught them life skills like, you know, something as dumb as how to tie a tie or shine your shoes or organize your locker. And what I would like you, sir, if you could comment on how the fact that the all-volunteer force is now fewer people are going through this conscription, how this has impacted our society, and how they're learning, or are they learning, these basic organizational life skills that the military draft taught that now isn't available to a lot of people now.
And I think that's what we all, and I say this is sort of an assumption, but that's what a lot of us yearn for, is that common experience. And you know, we romanticize the Israeli experience. Everyone has to be in the IDF. When you really go over there, is everyone in the IDF? No. Because if you look at Israel's example, that's what happens when you say universal conscription. Well, suddenly are you thinking about getting pregnant? Then you don't have to come in. And then we come up with so many reasons why people don't have to serve. That's what we'd have if we tried to do it here, because we don't need all those people. But then the question becomes, what takes the place? But let's not romanticize the draft either. During the Vietnam draft, like I said, deferments were the main event. It's like, who's not going to serve? Everyone focused on that, not who's coming in. So what we really are talking about is, so what bonds us as a people? What experience teaches us to be Americans first? Well, I hate to say it, but don't you admit it starts in the family? Doesn't it? And so we look to an institution to take the role of the family. We're looking for the quick fix. Send my kid off to this. It'll turn him into a citizen. It starts in the family, but that's really, really hard. And that takes our time and our sacrifice instead of an institution that the government provides that will turn my kid into an upstanding citizen. So it's much deeper than create an organization that will teach my kid to be a citizen.
We'll turn to Ron Granieri.
You mentioned the privilege of being able to take a question and answer the different one. I'm going to take the privilege of the questioner. So I'm going to ask you about something that you didn't talk about, but it relates to it, and that is you great presentation about the Army, great, and its relationship to the all-volunteer force. But I'm curious about the relationship between the all-volunteer Army and the all-volunteer Navy and the all-volunteer Air Force. The way that the different armed forces, his inter-service rivalry sharpened.
No.
By an all-volunteer force.
Yeah, because back during the 1980s, because people were concerned about civilian control over the military, Goldwater-Nichols was brought up. And Goldwater-Nichols said, you know what, we're going to establish that we're going to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff go straight to the Secretary of Defense, is that you service chiefs, you worry about your services, but these commanders in chiefs, the Schwarzkopfs, the Tommy Franks, the Petraeuses, they all go through the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, not through the services, because they didn't want the services to get too much power, and they wanted the president to be able to rule over it. But what it also did, Goldwater-Nichols Act, it said, we're going to create this thing called joint. And, you know, you want to be always Army? Well, guess what? If you want to be a general officer, you have to serve in a joint position. And a joint position is where you're working with both Navy, Air Force, Marines. and interagency. And so all the successful leaders in the Army, and actually in all the services, have had to have joint assignments. And so what does that do? Well, it breaks that insularity that we love. It breaks a lot of that narrowness, that myopia. And so I think you see, especially in the past wars that we've just had, the appreciation for being joint. And even though you love to play up the Army, Navy, Air Force, and even though the cultures are very distinct, the joint culture is immense now, and that's a huge shift.
Is there any difference in recruiting numbers or in recruiting
well,
patterns?
I mean, numbers are recruit more.
But patterns, yeah.
The Army has to recruit so many more than the Air Force. Now, does the Marines recruit more? No, they don't recruit more, but they recruit a lot for their size. Why? Because the Marines choose them up. They don't. The Marine is a young person's service. Is that they don't expect you to retire. If you want to retire, what service do you join? The Air Force, which is essentially joining Delta Airlines these days, you know. And so yeah, you join the Air Force if you want to retire. The funny thing is guess how the services handle the retirement budget. When a person comes in, you got to throw money into the retirement pot. The problem is when a person comes in, we don't know if that person is going to retire. And so here's the Army recruiting all these people. We got to throw money in that retirement pot, and guess who's taking it out? The Air Force. They say, thank you. And every year, the Air Force is reaping what the Army had to put into the retirement pot. And so the Army's like, we got to change this equation somehow, because that soaks up. But, you know, compensation, personnel compensation, I don't know how I even got into this. Okay, but I'm going to change the topic again. Personnel compensation takes up 30% of the Army's budget, okay? 30%. And so everything we do with a person, because you got to pay for the person's family, you got health care, you got a retirement, you got all that stuff, we are very, very, and it adds to the culture of the Army, person-oriented. The Air Force, they're platform-oriented. And so they have a platform and they build the people around it. The Navy, their hierarchy, because they're used to being on ships, you know, is very structured compared to the Army. When during the invasion of Grenada, they put Army guys on Navy ships, and the Army guys went over and said, okay, where do we bunk down? And the Navy turned to them and said, okay, your enlisted guys could be over there, and your officers could be over there. And the Army guys looked at them and said, well, you don't understand, we all sleep together. And the Air Force, or the Navy said, you can't do that. Because in the Navy, it's important to maintain that structure, that power distance, because you're on a ship, you got to know who's the boss. And, you know, in the Air Force, it's, hey, Bob, hey, Steve, and all that kind of stuff. So
I'm afraid we're out of time. I didn't think a talk on the all-volunteer force could be as entertaining as this, but we thank you very much, and we'll take a break.